Hello and welcome. I am the dramatic historian, Dr. Nathan Provost. Today, we are lucky enough to have Dr. Jonathan Steplyk on to talk about his book, Fighting Means Killing. Before we even start, do you just want to give us a general background about kind of why you became interested in this particular topic and kind of how you got to that argument?
Absolutely. So I'm absolutely a Civil War historian by trade. And the specific credit, I don't know, you might have this similar experience where kind of you're casting about for a dissertation topic and it's kind of it hits you, right? Once it feels right, it's right. And this project goes back, I'll credit Dr. Carol Reardon's awesome military history seminar at Penn State. She was my master's advisor. And we read, so hers was kind of a mixed seminar forum in that there were some books we all read together and there were others where we read different books and then came back and reported on them. And among those that I read for a class was Dave Grossman's On Killing. And that's a very influential book. And he kind of invented this philology field of study that's looking specifically at looking at soldiers in general and what the experience and expectations of killing in combat is like for them. And his major argument is that it's a significant stressor on combatants, on men in battle. We think of obviously the threat to yourself, the threat that something will happen to you, kill you or maim you or something, is indeed a major stressor. And he posits that the prospect or the experience of killing acts as a similar stressor. And he provides a really excellent framework for kind of not necessarily measuring, but organizing the different kinds of stressors or in the different kinds of ways that it can impact men, how it can either you're going to feel the full brunt of that or you're going to be kind of shielded from that, because in part there's a kind of a huge probably cultural and natural inhibition against killing our fellow man. So and war asks you to do that, so what does one do with that? So it hit me to his book is largely it's not limited to the 20th century, but it's significantly 20th century, and I thought let's take a look at a killology of Civil War soldiers. And I'm absolutely indebted to him for the concept and the framework. We differ on some points, and one of the major ideas behind my book is kind of the extent of the willing killers, as it were. So what I suggest in the book is that it is something that Civil War soldiers grapple with, and yet I find many of the factors that Grossman identified, in point of fact, Civil War soldiers were kind of, in many ways, shielded from a lot of the kind of stressor factors of killing, and this basically enabled them. A good number of Civil War soldiers were able to willingly accept and engage in the task in killing in battle. And so I go through it. I take basically a thematic approach, looking at battle in general, looking at what I call the language of killing, what kind of terminology do they actually use to describe it. I look at sharpshooters, look at hand-to-hand fighting, look at the experience of the United States colored troops, of African-American soldiers versus Confederate soldiers that they meet in battle. What I call the extremes of killing, when men are either going beyond the rules of warfare into atrocity or where they're deliberately hanging back from and resisting killing in combat. So looking at that whole spectrum of experience among Civil War soldiers in battle.
Yeah, the thing that really caught me with your introduction was that in your prologue, you actually start with a really interesting story. Alexandria, between Elmer Ellsworth and James Jackson. I'm curious why use that story to actually start your work talking about this whole concept? What's the connection there?
Sure. So, the great thing about this topic is it pulled in so many threads from my experience, both as, a young history buff and a history scholar. And it took advantage of all these different threads. And that the Marshall House episode, this clash between Elmer Ellsworth and James Jackson, is this iconic moment of the Civil War. It's really the start of the Civil War. So I can kind of summarize it too for your audience.
Yeah, that'd probably be best.
Sure. So it's May of 1861. The war is just on. Both sides are arming. Alexandria, Virginia is just across the Potomac River from D.C. A hotel known as the Marshall House flies a prominent Confederate flag from its rooftop. It can be seen from, if I recall correctly, from the Lincoln White House. Alexandria is key territory you want to hold on the other side of the Potomac if you mean to defend Washington. And so a force of troops goes into Alexandria. Prominent among them is Colonel Elmer Ellsworth of the 11th New York, and he goes a number of years back with Lincoln. He's very much kind of a protege of Lincoln's, kind of looks on him as a son. And it's a front to patriotic U.S. soldiers that this rebel banner is flying from the hotel. And Ellsworth's going to go and haul down those colors. And part of it, he suggests, too, is not only is it kind of a front to the Union cause, but I think Ellsworth suggests that, his fire zouaves, the 11th New York, these are rough and rowdy New York firemen. And maybe it's, we're going to get this down in part because, it's going to be hard to control these guys if they see something like that. Ellsworth proceeds up the stairs with a small party of guys, as well as a journalist, brings down this large colors. As he's coming down the stairway, out of the corridor steps James W. Jackson, proprietor of the Marshall House. This is his establishment. It's his flag. He is a very enthusiastic secessionist. He's a very loud and proud supporter of slavery. He comes out of the shadows with a shotgun, fires a fatal blast that hits Ellsworth in the chest. He's probably killed instantly. In front of Ellsworth is one of his Zouave soldiers, Francis Brownell. Sees the threat from Marshall, raises his musket to parry to strike the shotgun to drive it out of the way, and in their conflict manages to bayonet and shoot Brownell, killing him instantly. So I took that incident. And so, one, as long as I'm giving shout outs, the iconic Time Life Civil War series has one of the paintings commemorating this, like a full, single full page spread. And that very much kind of locked into my Civil War memory. What you have in this action among Ellsworth, Jackson, and Brownell, it kind of encapsulates a lot of what the Civil War is going to be about. It's literally a question of what flag is going to fly over Virginia. We can also look at Jackson himself represents a good deal of the motivations behind the Confederate cause. Each side in this fatal encounter has a victim and a killer. Now, for enthusiasts of, for Confederates early in the war, Jackson is one and the same. He has slain Ellsworth and he dies in the process. He's taken out by Corporal Brownell. On the Union side, you have Ellsworth, the victim, the fallen hero, and Brownell, who has slain the slayer, if you will. He is Ellsworth's avenger. And in fact, we're going to see, this is going to be kind of one of the lines of Union recruitment in the call to arms is avenge Ellsworth. Remember Ellsworth. There's going to be another regiment of New York Zouaves raised that call themselves the Ellsworth Avengers. So in this, we've got both sides have these set of heroes, right? And killing, the essence of war, killing is at the heart of this conflict. So you have one side celebrating the fallen Ellsworth and the man who avenged his killer. On the other side, the Confederates are celebrating the killer and victim. So it struck me as just this perfect hook. It comes early at the war. No major battles have been fought yet. Ellsworth is traditionally considered perhaps the first officer casualty on the U.S. side, perhaps both sides. Very early on, on both sides, it's very much a cause célèbre that's talked about in newspapers and poems and paintings, on stationery and things like that. So both sides are zeroing in on this idea of taking and losing life in a cause, basically. And that is my intro to a Civil War killology, if you will.
I'm curious. This isn't something I wrote down while I was reading, but just kind of you talking about this. So obviously this is really personal. I mean, it seems, at least it seems that way from the start. Does it surprise you, or maybe it doesn't? I don't know, but it seems to be, and that the casualties that we see slowly increase. Do you think that, or does it surprise you that it didn't either increase faster, or do you think it probably, does it somewhat meet those expectations of the violence that was to come, based upon how personal this was for each side, it seemed like?
That's an interesting question. So there is a strange pattern to how it starts out. So you have the firing at Fort Sumter, which officially inaugurates the Civil War. And notably, no one is killed in that actual exchange.
Right, yeah.
Not until Major Anderson's garrison fires its salutes and 2 men are tragically killed with artillery misfires. And of course, we've got the famous, well, the idea that, we've got 90-day volunteers, we're going to miss the big show, the big conflict. And of course, there's the image of the Washington socialites, heading out to follow the army and watching Bull Run. I think there's an incrementalism that kind of, we see the heat kind of turn up gradually. Yeah. And I think traditionally another one of the hallmarks is probably Shiloh.
Yeah.
Which is, as you know, the biggest battle, the bloodiest battle fought until that point, the biggest, bloodiest battle yet fought, as I tell my students, which obviously signals that it's going to get worse, as we know.
Which, and of course, I'm sure for them, that was hard to imagine that it could get worse.
Yes, more men are killed at Shiloh than all American wars, all previous conflicts put together, because we're fighting on a much larger scale, and virtually the vast majority of Civil War combatants, every man who dies or is killed is an American of one persuasion or another. So I think there's an incrementalism to it. It doesn't, you can see the factors that can let people imagine it's going to be a short war, and both sides, there's a great extent of overestimation and underestimation going on. And it's not surprising in that context that people like Sherman are seen as kind of out of the norm. Sherman famously tells Southern friends that this is, you're going to reap a whirlwind. You don't know the kind of fight that you're bringing on. This is going to be a large, catastrophic conflict. So I think most sides are kind of, like turning up the temperature of the boiling water. Okay. I'd say the timeline points in that regard. At some point, though, folks are just kind of hit with just the sheer scale of the dead and dying.
Right. Well, and at one point, you spoke about how soldiers in continuous combat could alternate between surprising ease,
Mhm.
between peaceful coexistence and actively trying to kill.
Mhm.
So my question is, did this apply to the men in the Virginia campaign of 1864 and 65? I mean, is this where it's most prevalent? You see this?
I think we see that, and I certainly have examples from the campaign and the subsequent siege operations at Petersburg. So I know that's a particular interest of yours, the whole continuous
Yeah,
combat, which which
yeah,
which absolutely changes the name of the game. And I think there's
right.
a persuasive, there's arguments out there that we start to see, it starts to resemble World War II combat conditions, in which eventually the army gets to this understanding like there's only so many days you can put men through combat, especially continuous combat, before they're kind of burnt out.
Yeah,
One of the things that interests me, this kind of back and forth, and I make a point about this. So one of the interesting limits of combat and limits of killing are the famous Civil War truces.
hmm,
And these are iconic, whether it's, guys sending boats across the line and so forth, meeting in the middle, and famously, so Union troops have good coffee to trade, and the Confederates have good tobacco, and both sides are interested in one another's newspapers. And the book I talk about, there's reactions to this, like, oh, if we didn't have to fight about this, some guys say it's all the leaders, right? We could, if the soldiers, if the ordinary men would just get together, we'd settle this. And notably, in terms of Civil War memory, a lot of folks are drawn to these feel-good stories of repartee and comradeship across the lines. At the same time, some of these guys say, hey, we're going to go back to fighting after this. There's a Confederate who leaves a note where it's like, I'm your friend on the picket line, but your enemy in battle, basically. So we can go back and forth. It doesn't mean, and some guys, it might, sap their willingness to kill. I think there's the famous World War I Christmas truce, right? And we
yeah,
actually see accounts from the officers like, this cannot happen. We will not permit this. We don't want it to erode the men's combat effectiveness. And with Civil War soldiers, they're relatively able to compartmentalize, it seems. Not generalizing, but a lot of them go back and forth between this. They're, soldiers for the working day, as it were. And it really
yeah.
depends on the circumstances and the individuals, and so many circumstances dictate how they respond to these conditions.
Right. Well, and it seems too that a lot of soldiers, even at night or during the day, they would talk to each other.
Mhm.
That's common. So
One of
it
the
is.
really
I mean,
interesting things we talk about, peace on the picket line,
yeah,
right? And you see this, I think, in both like popular and academic reactions. Like, they don't try to kill each other on the picket line.
yeah,
If you look at military standards, you're not supposed to. We have officers who say like, this mindless killing, we shouldn't have this kind of mindless killing on the picket line. And one of the things I specifically say in the book, the pickets, their job is to protect the army. They're that outer screen. What tells you that there's a problem, that there's a threat on the picket line? You open fire. If everybody's shooting every chance they get, that erodes the position of the picket line. I specifically say in the book, a quiet picket line is a happy picket line, or something to that effect. Per your interest in, the Virginia campaign, the Overland campaign, and later at Petersburg, we do see that erode, however, because in siege operations, it's perfectly legitimate. It's to be encouraged. It's desirable to keep the enemy's heads down. So you can have peaceful relationships on the picket line. I think at Vicksburg, they even like, okay, guys, we're gonna start shooting now. But on the picket line, it's worth, if it's not safe for the other guy to stick his head above the wall, that's desirable from a combat perspective. So even that line gets blurred. But I think uh, in normal field operations, I don't think a lot of people appreciate this. The pickets are not supposed to shoot at one another.
Yeah, well, this is the first time I'm even hearing this. So that's, I mean, I think that's really interesting. And maybe that, you see, that makes me wonder even more, right? Because it's like, okay, it's like you're almost building a rapport with this person. You might not know their name across the picket line, but you might see them like pretty regularly, possibly. But all of a sudden, there's this willingness to kill in the Civil War, and it's like, well, why is that? I mean, I think one thing that you noted that really stood out to me is that you called it a national fraternicide,
Oh,
um, and that was something that really kind of stood out. So it's like kind of this. I mean, at least when we're talking about reconciliation, it kind of. I mean, there's this notion that they're brothers in arms, but it's like, what is the willingness behind the violence that's taking place between them? Because it's extreme. It's very extreme.
it can.
So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but
So Grossman's book posited all these factors, right, that either make
yeah,
it easier or harder to kill. And what I find is like most of them, like it's working towards combat, towards effective killing. So one, I'm a big fan of James McPherson and For Cause and Comrades, and I very much subscribe to his idea that we largely have a significantly motivated body of citizen soldiers. It runs the gamut, but I think he proves pretty convincingly that more than half of soldiers expressed some sincere ideological commitment to their respective causes. And McPherson himself is very charitably but firmly pushing back against this assumption. And it kind of reflects the 20th century experience where there's much less, so go World War II, there's a general sense that, the Axis are bad, the Allies are on the right side. It comes a lot, much more to kind of comradeship, I think, in World War II combat. They're still motivated, but Civil War soldiers are perhaps the most ideological of soldiers we've seen in American military history. And I frequently comment, in terms of popular memory, I often push back against this notion. I think there's a lot of people like the notion of soldiers as victims, and it's like war is something that happens to them and they get thrust into, and that's an element of the story. But there's a self-servingness. They like to see, okay, if we have this terrible fratricidal conflict, they don't want to be in it. And that was the appeal of kind of the Craven school earlier in Civil War historiography. And I point to, we've got men who are, they come of age kind of midway or later through the antebellum era. These issues have been slowly building. So you have tremendous impetus back home. We're going to see dissatisfaction on the home front and in the ranks during the war. But there is tremendous societal support for both sides. There's, I think, one of McPherson's chapters is we know we're supported at home. So there's positive reinforcement in that regard. You have tremendous group cohesion in the Civil War. It's much different than modern style combat when you're very much an open order and individuals are much more responsible for specific combat operations. Linear warfare from the 18th and 19th centuries, it's very conducive to command and control, to fire control. And I talk about, there was the famous World War II historian Slam Marshall, who controversially argued that only a small fraction of combat GIs fired their weapons in battle. And people debate that, but Marshall's argument from that was we need greater fire control. We need officers to be able to effectively maximize the firepower of their units. In linear warfare, you're in a line of battle, and the soldier is, if you're in the line of battle, you're largely responsible. You do what your orders tell you. You march this way, you march in this formation, you load and fire when you're told to, if you're following by volley. There's what Grossman calls group absolution. So do you necessarily feel like you personally are taking a life? In modern warfare, we see people like, gunners in the Navy, artillerymen, bombers. They're very much separated from the direct sense of taking life in combat. The Civil War battle experience is rather conducive to that too, because, let's say it's a volley fire. You're all firing together. Acrid white smoke. It's very hard to see. Often in intense firefights, the soldiers say they're just aiming for the flashes of the guns. So under those circumstances, group absolution, you're one of many, you're following orders. Good luck if you actually know what your bullet does. So there's all these factors that if we posit killing is a stressor on men on combat, then we've got all these mitigating factors. We've got all these things shielding soldiers from the harshest experiences of combat in those circumstances.
Okay. No, I didn't even consider that. No, that's great.
And that's not always the case, but that is kind of the general norm of Civil War combat looks like that. You can experience it on a much more visceral level as a Civil War soldier. Again, circumstances.
Well, it certainly got more especially at certain times, obviously the fighting became very personal.
Mm-hmm.
Much more so than simply firing a gun and maybe not knowing where that particular bullet went, whether it's like at the mule shoe.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm not sure if you'd like to talk about that at all, but
what fascinates me most about the bloody angle there, and this is also I've written elsewhere about the Battle of Franklin, something we see at both those actions. And you might have seen, I've got an illustration of it somewhere in the book. Men will be on the opposite side of an earthwork and basically lifting their muskets over to fire. And Grossman calls this thing called posturing, where there's different, there's fighting, there's shooting to kill, there's refusing to shoot, and then there's kind of just shooting to make noise, to keep rounds going downrange, to keep the enemy at bay. At the Mule Shoe and at Franklin, we see guys on opposite sides of the earthworks at different times. It takes a lot to actually go over the top and engage in hand-to-hand combat. And of course, that does happen at both of those battles. It happens quite intensely. It's dangerous simply to stick your head above the trench, let alone go charging over it. So many men are reloading as fast as they can. They're passing loaded muskets forward and just firing over the top to keep the enemy at bay, which is kind of remarkable from that. It's very much a middle ground. You have to know you're not going to be doing a lot of execution. You're not going to be doing a lot of killing, but it's a positive thing to do. And I think Paddy Griffith, the great British historian who was interested in both, he covered the Napoleonic Wars as well as the Civil War. He anticipated a lot of things that Grossman said and that I said, that it's a positive action. Being able to fire at the enemy is kind of a relief, as it were. And it's distant, right? It's like, as I write in the book, you let powder and ball do the work for you.
Yeah. Well, there was something that you, getting back to your book here, there's a part that you focused specifically on sharpshooting. And, just by the way, another quick plug here for Dr. Steplyk. He has written a really good chapter in an edited book, Vicksburg Besieged, about sharpshooting. So highly recommend that. Just a quick little plug there. Anyway,
I'm proud of that chapter too.
Yeah, no, that's it's really good work. So, but something that I actually I always thought this was kind of interesting was, we typically hear of this notion as like sharpshooting is like dishonorable, right? Like it's not something that, soldiers would do. But I mean, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, they were pretty I would say at least sharpshooters, they were pretty proud of their work at times. Even in my own research at Cold Harbor, they found a Confederate sharpshooter. They found 13 notches in the actual stock of the gun.
If I knew that detail, it would have gone in the book.
Yeah. Well, I would actually like to hear it more from your perspective.
Absolutely. I think, and being genuinely proud, I think one of my most interesting contributions is the book is pushing back against the degree of sharpshooting is dishonorable. And so we've got sources for it. Interestingly, many people have seen the, no, I shouldn't be blanking on the artist's name. Let's flip open. Winslow Homer. It's when you.
There we go.
Winslow Homer has his famous illustration of a Union sharpshooter up in a tree.
Yeah.
He told us afterward, like, oh, this profession, this idea, like, horrified me, And so, sharpshooting, you are very much trying. You are among the combatants trying the hardest to knowingly take someone out, especially at, a particular target. There's a number of other quotes I use. I'm going to blank on but there's a Union quote and a Confederate quote. And they talk about how I always hated that profession. I despise them. And one of the things I noticed, and what was so remarkable is, reading lots of books, a lot of books quote the same several fellows again and again, saying how much we hate sharpshooters. And those are valid sources. Those guys speak for a portion. And again, we kind of, I think to some extent, depending on how you look at the Civil War, some folks like, okay, we take credit, or we take comfort in that. Like, these guys don't go in for that sort of thing. Except for all the guys who do, who are very enthusiastic sharpshooters. One of the things I make clear is that sharpshooter is a very slippery term in the Civil War. Of course, the term sniper was almost unheard of. That's much more 20th century. The sharpshooter in theory, sharpshooter is the Civil War equivalent of sniper. And we hear sniper, we think of kind of like your lone man or a sniper team picking off individuals. That certainly happens in the Civil War. As I suggest in that chapter, though, a sharpshooter can be anybody who's just trying especially hard to shoot accurately on his own. So many cases, so many official reports refer to just skirmishers as sharpshooters. I've got a Patty Griffith book in my collection where he kind of muses that, in some cases, sharpshooters were just skirmishers who could shoot straight. So it absolutely runs the gamut from picked marksmen with very sophisticated training, including like range estimation and so forth, to guys doing their best with their standard issue muskets. Part of the important background, looking at how Americans feel about sharpshooters, is look at the American past. We still celebrate the Revolutionary War riflemen. And historians are still kind of find themselves, it has been mythologized, and the rifleman is very much a auxiliary kind of within the Revolutionary Army. But they were there, they did matter. But we've over the years, we've very much played them up. And you go to the War of 1812, the same thing. Andrew Jackson, his campaign song is The Hunters of Kentucky. And that's the song that perhaps coined the term Kentucky rifle for the American long rifle. So there's an American past celebrating men who can shoot straight, men who can shoot to kill. Another great source, there's a wonderful Harper's Weekly cover, and it's from the recruitment of Berdan sharpshooters. So Hiram Berdan is a well-known marksman, and he sets out to recruit ultimately 2 regiments of picked marksmen. He canvasses most of the northern states. They have to meet a special sharp, marksmanship requirement. This great cover on Harper's Weekly has all these vignettes of the sharpshooters. They're testing their prowess and so forth. And there's, ladies and gentlemen, there's well-dressed civilians coming out to watch this. This is not something hidden or shameful. This is polite society taking an interest in this. And there's that great episode when Abraham Lincoln shows up to the sharpshooters camp. And somebody has, I think it's on a piece of canvas, like drawn a kind of cartoonish image of Jefferson Davis. And if you look at it, we have a reproduction of it. It looks arguably more like PGT Beauregard. But anyway, ostensibly it's Davis. And Berdan is going to take a shot at him. And he's not sure about, like, he kind of defers to the president, okay, it's his opposite number and all that sort of thing. And Lincoln's like, oh, it's a, and he shoots, gets him right under the eye. And Lincoln laughs off, like, oh, it was a pretty lucky shot, wasn't it? Because it was, Berdan was a marksman, but it was, things worked out for him well. So Lincoln gets kind of a good laugh over that. So Lincoln doesn't express any horror at sharpshooting. In fact, he famously tests out repeating rifles out by the Washington Monument. He's interested in the latest, best technology for U.S. soldiers.
Well, and I think the one episode I always get drawn to is the death of Sedgwick at Spotsylvania Courthouse, and it's like, how many Confederate soldiers took credit for that? I mean, there's a lot, and so if you have all these guys trying to take credit, I mean, is it really something that they felt bad about? I mean, no, it kind of goes back to your point there. So no, that's exactly right. There was one thing that I actually this is kind of this is maybe getting a little bit away from your book here, but I'd be curious to know, do you think that if you were to try to collect all this information and all this data, specifically from border states, so how do you think that would actually impact your research? I mean, if we're talking about like Missouri or, and I, obviously here I'm a little bit biased, but, I'm curious, just kind of from your perspective, if you think it would change or if maybe it'd almost be worse to an extent. I don't know.
It's a great question. It's a really stimulating question. So the book, I take kind of a holistic approach to Civil War soldiers in general.
Right. Yes.
Biggest thing I saw was, okay, there's certain circumstances that affect U.S. versus Confederate soldiers differently. And in the book, I very pointedly pair off Union and Confederate accounts when they match up.
Yeah.
I didn't get a strong sense, and somebody could definitely go deeper into this. I don't get a strong state sense. The idea of border state soldiers, and I do kind of punt on this issue. Early on in the book, I say, okay, we're not looking at the really intense border war in Missouri, right? So we're not quite going irregular. I'm pretty much sticking to standard combat. So you're probably familiar with some of the great literature out there about the guerrillas, about Quantrill versus the Redlegs. So that's kind of its own field. When it comes to border states, one of the episodes that does come to mind, however, and this is one I invoke frequently when folks say, like, it's not really a civil war because they're not fighting for control of the central government. Well, when the same people are fighting, it's perfectly legitimate to call the revolution a civil war because it does pit people of the same society, even the same communities. And my go-to example of that is the Battle of Front Royal, Jackson's Valley campaign. Battle of Front Royal sees a clash between the 1st Maryland CS and the 1st Maryland US. You've got Marylanders from both sides engaged in pretty hot and heavy combat. in Front Royal. And that's anecdotal now. We could crunch, the accounts specifically of border state soldiers. My sense is that we wouldn't necessarily see a particularly strong difference on a given battlefield. If it's something happening for like control of territory, if there's very, very local elements to it, we might see that change. In terms of the field armies, I don't necessarily see it changing a lot.
Maybe I'm thinking of like the Camp Jackson affair in St. Louis, right? Right at the start of the Civil War, and in instances like those, really. I just was kind of curious to see what you kind of thought about that. Sorry if that was kind of like I know that kind of was a little bit off topic there, but
no, it's a great way to approach it. It's a great question.
Yeah. Well, one of the other questions that kind of came up for me was, how do you think that, I don't know, how that moral framework evolved over the course of the war?
Mm-hmm.
Is like these casualty lists continued to grow longer, or
Mm-hmm.
did it change at all?
Change over time is a very smart element to bring into this. That's a very historical question. And I think it reminds me of certain elements of my work. So it was interesting to see how often Civil War soldiers talk about revenge, specifically losing their own comrades. It's like, and one soldier writes, the loss of comrades maddened me. So there's this very specific idea of we've lost men, and this can apply during the heat of battle and even longer, right? I think there's understanding that we have some highly motivated citizen soldiers in the Civil War. I think there's kind of a reinforcement that goes on as we keep expending more blood and treasure, right? It has to, these dead shall not have died in vain. We kind of we have to continue the fight. Obviously, some soldiers get disenchanted and want no more part of this, or at the very least, if they never see another battle again, that would suit them. But I think we do see a really strong, what McPherson would call sustaining motivation.
Yeah.
In terms of both, like what both sides feel is at stake.
Right.
Politically, socially, but also in terms of the men they've already lost. We're not going to let them have died in vain. So I think there's some war weariness that sets in, and then you have to look at, okay, one side by 64, 65 is at some point clearly winning, and another is clearly losing.
Now, when you were conducting your research, did you come across letters or any journal entries about how, I lost so and so? Did it seem like they mentioned their comrades often when they were writing home?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's an indication of the revenge idea, like the mentioning of, Johnny was killed yesterday from this explosion? And I mean, anyway, I'll let you answer that, but
some it absolutely affects, right? And we see that in other conflicts too. And so, of course, Civil War soldiers are in an interesting position because their units are so local.
Yeah.
World War II, think of your typical World War II movie, and there's a guy from Brooklyn and a guy from Texas and a guy from California. Civil War units are so local. They typically come from the same town or the same county or the same corner of a state. Maybe you'll have guys thrown together from different parts of the state, but there is guys are enlisting with their school buddies, brothers, cousins, and so forth. And we Civil War historians talk so much about how there's a strong sense of, I can't let my comrades down. I can't let them down. And the folks at home are going to hear about it if I turn tail and run. And it's such a remarkable thing. And obviously men can form really intense bonds in the military and in combat, even if they've come from, if they've just been thrown together by the war. Something that struck me, a number of years ago in my own reenacting unit, we lost a guy to heart failure, and it was really a kind of stand-up moment, or it's like, imagine going into an action when you've got this many friends, and it's kind of this death lottery. Will you survive? Not only that, but how many of your buddies, kinfolk, etc., are going to come out of this alive? It's a really remarkable thing to endure. And so there's also that sense of, regiments are so community oriented, you're keeping folks back home informed. There's information going back both ways. So you're very likely to be talking about who you've lost and how it's affected you.
You've mentioned you've made some connections with future conflicts when you were writing, and so I'm actually, I'll just go ahead and ask. So what are some of the connections you actually see between the research in your book in the nature of combat in the 20th and 21st century even?
One of the biggest difference that comes to mind is, well, one, what we expect of the individual soldier, especially the grunt in the battlefield, is so much. The level of training that's expected of you. Linear tactics, you learn the school of the soldier, the school of the company, you learn the school of the battalion. You learn how to load and fire and how to march which way, and your actions are very much dictated. You're part of a military machine. And there's limits to that, so skirmishing and sharpshooting and so forth, but the standard line of battle. Today, we see this in kind of the light infantry revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries, as different nations experiment with light infantry, men who by design are trained more, who have to exercise more individual initiative. So there's a lot more, I think, we ask of that. Just the level of training to pull off, think of, a house clearing operation and so forth. So there's a lot more individual initiative expected. And there's probably elements of, we have smokeless powder. I think a lot of firefights today take place. I think the recent experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq reflect, especially kind of urban fighting, you've got close quarters, right? So, and this would be, somebody better versed than I can talk about how much more likely you are to know what your bullet does. One of the things, this gets away from killing less, but I think one of the huge changes in combat too, modern combat is, and this is similar to your idea of continuous contact. One of the things we see elements of in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and Iraq is like no clear front lines. And so you're kind of always on, as it were. It's that same continuous conflict. There isn't that same matter of relief. Civil War soldiers, we famously talk about, their services, with 95% boredom and 5% moments of terror. And so soldiers obviously have downtime, but when you're in a situation like that where you can have, random ambushes and mortar strikes and things like that, I think it changes the name of the game. Absolutely. And that gets into one of those more traditional stressors where, what could the enemy do to me? So that's modern combat tends to lack many of the shields that blunted what the experience of combat could do to Civil War soldiers.
Well, let's stay on that topic of stressors, and because you're saying that they're always on, and that's a great connection. I never even considered that. But towards the end of your book, you talked a lot about, and you even mentioned here at the beginning, you talked about the USET, the United States Colored Troops. And I feel like you would probably agree that they probably felt on for a good portion of the battle, because obviously the consequences are going to be a lot more severe. So I'm curious I'd like you to actually touch on that just a little bit, because I actually found that really, it was insightful. It was really insightful.
Yeah, this really comes in loud and clear from the battles that African American soldiers were involved in. I think it's when USCT go up against Confederates. It's some of the most visceral fighting. For so many Confederates, it's absolutely unconscionable to send black men, former slaves or otherwise, into battle against white men. You know, the South at large, the Confederacy at large, socially, politically, soldiers, civilians treats this as just unconscionable. And then you've got the Confederate policy, we're going to treat them as, you know, slaves in rebellion and so forth. So we have this, you know, dirty, not so secret about the extent of atrocities towards black soldiers in combat, whether it's not taking prisoners or brutalizing prisoners afterwards, battlefield massacres and things like that. And that has a flip side too. So the USCT are among the most intensely motivated US soldiers in the Civil War. The vast majority of Union soldiers, white Union soldiers, have to fight for something less tangible. What will happen to the country if we have secession and disunion? You know, Confederates can always fall back on, you know, we're fighting for our homes. We're fighting, you know, our land is being invaded, so we're fighting for that. Union troops, most of them, they have something somewhat less tangible. Not to say that they can't be fervent about it, but it's less visceral. But if you're a African American soldier, the future of you, your family, people like you are very much in the balance. Your own experience, it doesn't take long for black soldiers to realize what they face on the other side. Examples like Fort Pillow, they learn very quickly that they're very likely to face little or no quarter. And this is true, something that's true in combat, regardless of whether there's a racial component. It can be a cultural difference. But when two sides meet and they're playing by very different sets of rules, or one, they just know one side is going to, you know, abandon the rules, well, you're going to fight fire with fire. Remember Fort Pillow. If they're going to show us no quarter, we'll show them no quarter. And so this is interesting dynamic, and I posit, and I think we probably see relatively less post-combat action, battlefield atrocities by black soldiers, only to the extent that there's more of an effort. Sometimes we see their officers or we see other soldiers intervene to stop it, and they're not monolithic. Some men won't do it, period. They're not acting as a single monolith, as a single block. There's far more sanction among the Confederates, whether it's Fort Pillow or Saltville or the Crater. But, you know, knowing that and what each side represents to the other, so that's why we see some of the most visceral, some of the most personal Civil War killing is between those two sides.
Do you think that there's another factor involved when it comes to Confederate motivations, especially when it comes to seeing an African American man holding a gun in front of them? Because it almost seems to be there's a different reaction, a very intense reaction that's different. I don't know if that would just simply fall under their the idealism of the Southern cause, right? The extension and sustaining slavery, but I don't know if you would put that in a different category or not.
I think you can't get away from the social outrage it would provoke, right? We get these, again, visceral reactions both from soldiers and civilians. The idea of, you know, sending black men to fight white soldiers. What it reminds me too, one of the most, and this is a pattern I saw, this was really kind of chilling. So after a battle, you've got these USCT casualties, right? And I found a number of cases, soldiers and civilians marveling at, oh, look at how much property was just destroyed. Think how many dollars worth of slaves we just ended by that. And that's a very cold calculus right there.
Yeah, and I think, it speaks to the point too. It's like, okay, well, this is one of those consequences that puts them like, or is always having them on the entire time. So they obviously understood that what would happen would be worse for them than it would be for their white comrade in arms that's fighting with them. So
Right.
yeah, no. Okay, well, we are starting to get towards the end here. I actually would like to know, though, if someone were to read this book, what is the greatest takeaway you want there to be for the reader? What do you want them to take away from it?
As I was thinking about that, so there's different ways I can go, and what kind of became very crystal clear actually is Civil War soldiers have agency, which is a great great historical scholar word, but it works. They're not simply victims, and soldiers can be victims, can be victimized by combat and wartime experience, but it's not simply that. I think a lot of people take comfort in soldiers as victims, like they don't want to be part of this, they're just pawns in the game. And then as I already suggested, I don't really subscribe to that. The craven, it's the fanatics on both sides that get us into this, right? I see the American nation, these warring nations, help make the Civil War happen. But Civil War soldiers have agency too. I think I've talked about how McPherson's book, For Cause and Comrades, is hugely influential. It's widely read, it's widely assigned, and it's still as widely read and appreciated as it is. We don't have enough popular readers reading it because so many folks there's this sense like, the soldier who he's just part of the flow of history. He's not might not be in this, but no, they can. And I don't really. This is kind of what you want to read into the text. I don't really identify with the soldier as pawn narrative. My imagination is more captured by the invested soldiers. And so, these men do have initiative. They do, and whether that's, the actions they take, the wording they choose to use. I'm particularly proud of that chapter because the words we use tell us how we feel about things. They, mold and shape how they feel about things and the actions they take. And I think it's really a more interesting story. Again, it runs the gamut. There's a full spectrum of ready to kill, enthusiastic, hoping to kill, refusing to kill, and then, it's probably a bell curve. It's probably more men like, I'm willing to, if I have to, for the cause and for what the enemy represents. I think I just identify more with, it's far more compelling, these soldiers who, and we see a lot of them, soldiers who know what they're about and kind of follow through on that, whatever that takes. So Civil War soldiers are not simply guys that things happen to. They are actors in this. I present that idea. We talk about risking your life in combat, but as George Patton famously said, the idea was making the other guy die for a cause. So that's an element that we often kind of sweep under the rug. It's something a lot of readers like, oh, that's kind of something very stark that they have to wrestle with. Me as a Civil War historian, or as a military historian, it's very easy to, that captured my imagination. That's what fueled, in large part, undertaking this project in the first place.
Well, and I think the greatest thing, honestly, about your work is it almost gives them a voice, right? It's like, this is their decision. This is their choice. They are conducting these actions. You're exactly right. It's not like they're some pawn. I feel like we always tend to think, and especially like some, big Civil War readers, I feel like, especially when we first start reading, we tend to think of, you know, soldiers as belonging to a regiment or a brigade or a corps or something like that. Like they're this single body unit that either fails or succeeds. But it's so much more than that. And I think I think your work just does such a great job of just really expressing that. So
I love what you said about voice. And I think I totally agree. And I think, you know, Civil War soldier accounts are just endlessly fascinating. The things they come up with, the things that sometimes sound like our own lingo, they're just endlessly fascinating. And one of the things I think, you know, more popular students, more buffs should delve into are those soldier accounts, because they're so, it's great too in the 1880s when all the generals are kind of fighting these, you know, post-war battles of memory.
yeah,
The soldiers come along and say, hey, what about our story? And so we have this wonderful explosion of literature in the forms of published diaries and memoirs and unit histories, and we have such an embarrassment of riches in the study of the Civil War in the words of the men themselves.
well, and I agree. And there's still quite a few journals I know that are still unpublished, and there's a lot of great material out there. So I'm in complete agreement with you on all of that. But I really do want to thank you so much for your time today and joining us. And I really appreciated it.
Absolutely, and I was happy to accept. This has been great for me as well.
Well, thank you. I'm the Dramatic Historian. Please make sure to subscribe over on our YouTube channel, as well as on Facebook and Substack. All right. Thank you. Have a great Saturday. All right. So I'll edit out the